The morning it happened, the sky over Cypress Ridge was painfully blue. The kind of blue that makes you think the world is still safe, still decent, still functioning the way it's supposed to. That illusion shattered before 9 a.m. Caleb had always been the quiet one. At 7 years old, he wasn't much for video games or noisy toys. What he loved, truly loved, was drawing dinosaurs. Not just doodles. These were full-blown murals in chalk, bursting with prehistoric battles across the wide concrete canvas of our suburban sidewalk. He was out there that Saturday, seated cross-legged, oblivious to the world, sketching a Tyrannosaurus in a boxing stance. It was our favorite kind of morning. Peaceful, filled with grilled bacon in the air, and completely ordinary. Michelle, my wife, was watering the rosemary bushes behind the house, humming along to Fleetwood Mac. I had just stepped onto the porch with a cup of black coffee when I noticed the vehicle. A matte black Dodge Durango, unmarked, tinted windows, humming low and slow like it had a purpose. It didn't belong to anyone on our cul-de-sac. I knew every car on this street. It pulled up right next to Caleb. No sirens. No lights. No decals. Just silence and menace and four wheels. Then two men stepped out. They wore khaki tactical vests stamped with HOA Enforcement Unit in stark white letters. No name tags. No clipboard. One of them, tall, bald, stocky, scanned the area like it was a war zone. The other, younger, eyes twitching like a live wire, held what looked like a tablet. They were too fit, too militant, too wrong. I felt it before I understood it. Something wasn't right. Caleb, still drawing, didn't look up. The men didn't speak to him. They didn't warn. They simply hovered. The bald one stepped forward and looked down at the artwork like it was a crime scene. The younger one started snapping pictures with the tablet. Then one of them pulled a laminated sheet from his vest and waved it vaguely in my direction. I came down the steps slowly. The air felt heavier with every stride. "This is your child?" the bald one asked without preamble. "Yes," I said. "What's going on?" He held up the paper. It looked official at a glance, but only for a glance. Something about defacement of shared visual corridors and violations of HOA Article 12C. It was nonsense. Worse, fabricated nonsense dressed up to look like law. Before I could respond, he said it. Noncompliance has consequences. And then he struck. It happened so fast, it didn't feel real. He shoved Caleb. No hesitation. No warning. My son's body flew backward and slammed into the pavement with a sound that split the morning in half. The sound of a skull cracking against concrete isn't something you forget. Not ever. Michelle's scream pierced the neighborhood. I dropped my mug, the coffee vanishing into the grass like it never existed. I ran. My knees buckled as I scooped Caleb into my arms. Blood. So much blood. His limbs hung at angles that made no anatomical sense. He wasn't crying. He couldn't. He was gasping, trying to pull air through lips that were already turning blue. Then came the moment that changed everything. The younger man reached for his waistband. I didn't see a badge. I saw intent. Michelle lunged forward with raw instinct, not care, not calculation, just pure maternal defense. But before anything else could happen, it came loud, mechanical, undeniable. Drop your weapon. Hands in the air. From both ends of the street, black SUVs with real government plates converged. Real police. Real tactical units. Within seconds, the two men were surrounded. There was no firefight, no resistance. Just immediate surrender, their false bravado shriveling in the face of actual power. Paramedics pushed past the chaos. They checked Caleb's vitals, stabilized his neck, loaded him onto a stretcher. The entire street froze in suspended horror. Neighbors peeked from windows, cell phones in hand. The footage would go viral within hours, but none of that mattered then. What mattered was the tiny, broken body on that stretcher. They wouldn't let us in the ambulance. Too many passengers, liability, they said. So I rode in the back of a patrol cruiser, blood on my shirt, wife's hand in mine, silence pressing harder than any siren. At the ER, we learned the damage. 28 fractures, internal bleeding, a skull fracture near the temporal lobe, one collapsed lung. The surgeons didn't say miracle. They said, "We'll try." I sat there, in the hallway outside the OR, staring at a vending machine that refused to give me my Snickers bar. That was the moment I broke, not at the crime scene, not in the cruiser, but staring at a goddamn vending machine, hands still stained with my son's blood, because everything around me was stupid and cruel and utterly out of place. Hours passed. Then a detective arrived. Calm. Professional. She introduced herself as Detective Brianna Mendez from the County Special Response Division. They're not who they say they are, she told me, handing over a dossier with surveillance photos, names, and bank records. The men weren't part of any HOA. They weren't law enforcement. They were contractors from a disbanded private military firm, hired by a rogue ex-HOA board member who'd been using intimidation tactics to police the neighborhood on his own terms. These enforcers were part of a larger operation spanning 5 states: falsified citations, unauthorized home entries, fake inspections, and in rare cases, abductions. They weren't just here to find you, Mendez said. They were here to take him. The breath left my lungs in one long, final gasp. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I felt hollow, like my body had collapsed inward. They targeted children, she continued. Specifically, homes where cameras were down, adults were distracted, or, their words, fear was easier to manufacture. My son wasn't collateral. He was inventory. But not anymore. He had screamed. He had resisted. And that resistance was what delayed them, long enough for our security system to ping a friend of mine in the sheriff's office, who called in a favor from a nearby federal task force. That's what saved him. Not me. I failed. But he didn't. And from that failure, something new would rise. Hospitals, for all their sterile precision and blinking machines, have a way of erasing time. You don't know if it's day or night, Monday or Thursday. You measure existence in heart monitor beeps and doctor glances. And for me, the world narrowed to one thing: Caleb. He survived the first surgery. Barely. The doctors came out one by one: orthopedic, neurosurgical, trauma, each speaking like engineers trying to describe the damage after a structural collapse. Broken bones were the least of it. Internal bruising. A partially detached retina. A suspected tear in his brain's protective membrane. They couldn't promise us anything. They didn't even try. Michelle never left his side. She slept in a chair by his bed, fingers always curled around his. I stayed nearby, hovering like a ghost in a hoodie. I only went home once, to grab clothes. When I pulled into the driveway, the chalk was still there. Only now, Caleb's dinosaur mural was smeared in red and black, tire tracks, boot prints, blood. A brontosaurus missing its head. A T-Rex slashed across the belly. I stood there for a long time, too long. Then I walked back inside and packed a bag, not saying a word. Back at the hospital, things moved quickly, but not in the way we hoped. Detective Mendez returned. This time, she wasn't alone. A federal agent accompanied her. His name was Special Agent Cole, Department of Homeland Security, Counter-Impersonation Division. We've been tracking these guys, he told us. But this incident blew it wide open. Turns out the attack on Caleb was the final piece of a long trail. The 2 fake enforcers, now identified as Mason Blake and Eli Rollins, weren't just rogue. They were part of a pilot program gone rogue. Years ago, a private security company named Centrican Response had been subcontracted by wealthy HOAs to enforce neighborhood compliance in difficult communities. When their license was pulled after a lawsuit involving unlawful detainment, some of their operatives scattered, most quietly vanished. But a few, like Blake and Rollins, kept the uniforms, the gear, and the tactics. They began selling their services off the books, targeting neighborhoods with weak oversight. Cypress Ridge was ideal. Our HOA had gone inactive during COVID. Its leadership was gutted. Only one ex-board member remained, a man named Howard Risch, who quietly continued signing off internal forms and HOA letters, long after his authority had expired. He's the one who hired them. Risch had been fined years ago for zoning violations on a pool renovation. Since then, he'd turned bitter, paranoid, convinced the neighborhood needed a stronger hand. Blake and Rollins were his hand. Their method was horrifyingly simple. They'd enter communities dressed in tactical uniforms, cite obscure community violations, hand out fake citations, and if someone resisted, well, they had muscle. They justified everything with the illusion of authority. The HOA vest. The documents. The lingo. People rarely questioned it. Until Caleb. And now, the country was about to. News broke 3 days after the incident. Local first, then national. Child assaulted by fake HOA cops scrolled across every headline. The doorbell cam footage, grainy but damning, leaked online. Millions watched as Caleb's small frame was struck down in broad daylight. Protests followed. Not violent ones, but persistent. Candlelight vigils. Chalk murals appeared across sidewalks in solidarity. Someone started a hashtag Justice for Caleb. Celebrities posted drawings of T-Rexes holding shields. Kids from Ohio to Oregon began chalking their sidewalks in protest, daring anyone to call it vandalism. But amid the chaos, Caleb was still in pain. His bones had to be reset twice. Screws and pins were drilled into his femur. He couldn't sleep without nightmares. We learned that trauma didn't scream. It whispered, night after night, creeping into quiet moments. And yet, slowly, the boy fought back. His third week in recovery, he asked for chalk. Not to draw dinosaurs. Just a sun. A small, uneven circle in orange with tiny rays. He didn't say anything when he drew it on the back of a paper tray liner. But Michelle and I looked at each other and knew he was still here. Not whole, not healed, but still Caleb. Meanwhile, the legal war escalated. The feds charged Blake and Rollins with impersonating federal officers, assault with intent to maim, racketeering, and attempted kidnapping of a minor. A grand jury indicted Howard Risch for conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful impersonation of HOA authority, and facilitating criminal enterprise on residential property. They all pled not guilty. That's when I realized this wouldn't end with arrests. We had to go further. We had to burn the roots. So I did something I never imagined. I called in favors. I was a former compliance auditor for a federal housing agency. I hadn't worked in the field in 5 years, but I still had contacts. I called lawyers, policy advisors, even a former senator's aide. I told them everything. I shared the footage, the paperwork, the contracts Risch had signed. I laid it all out. And they listened. Because Caleb wasn't just a victim. He was a headline. And headlines change laws. 3 weeks later, a new initiative was drafted, the Community Accountability Act, a proposed federal framework that would require registration of all third-party HOA enforcers, mandatory training, clear identification, and an online verification system for all HOA interactions involving residents or minors. At first, no one believed it would move. But then chalk justice happened. Michelle and I didn't start it. Our neighbor did. A retired art teacher named Louise began organizing sidewalk murals outside the hospital. The media covered it. Then a local nonprofit stepped in. Then an attorney from Austin offered pro bono services to families impacted by neighborhood intimidation. In less than 2 months, Chalk Justice became a legal aid network spanning 5 states. And Caleb? He became its symbol. One photo changed everything. A photographer caught him sitting in his hospital bed, in a blue gown, cast on his arms and legs, holding a piece of chalk. Behind him, on the window, someone had taped a child's drawing of a T-Rex roaring over 2 shadowy figures. The caption underneath, "This time, the dinosaur wins." That image went everywhere. News outlets, billboards, even Time magazine's digital cover. But for us, it wasn't about fame. It was about making sure no one could ever weaponize authority like that again. It was about making sure no one could knock on a door in fake uniform and take what didn't belong to them, not with a clipboard, not with threats, and never with violence. That's what Caleb fought for. And in a few weeks, he would get to say it himself, in court. Courtrooms are built for control. Every creak of the floor, every scratch of a pen, every carefully timed pause from the judge, they all reinforce the illusion that law is a machine, precise and untouchable. But that morning, the courtroom felt like a volcano on the edge of rupture. Michelle and I sat side by side on the second row behind the prosecution bench. Caleb was between us, in a wheelchair fitted with temporary braces. His cast had been freshly signed by nurses, friends, and even one firefighter who showed up at the hospital with a toy raptor and no explanation. Caleb didn't smile much those days, but he hadn't stopped clutching that raptor since. The courtroom was full. Not with reporters, although they were outside, swarming the courthouse steps like bees, but with people who cared. Veterans, teachers, parents from Caleb's school. A man I didn't recognize held a cardboard sign that read, "Real men protect children. Pretenders destroy lives." I had expected to feel anger when the 2 men entered. But what washed over me instead was something colder: detachment. Blake and Rollins were wheeled in separately, both shackled, both dressed in bright orange jumpsuits that erased the fearsome image they once tried to project. The weight of real consequences had crushed whatever posturing they had left. Their eyes didn't search for sympathy. They avoided us entirely. Then came the one I hadn't expected to see, Howard Risch, the former HOA chair who authorized their presence, the man whose signature was found on the fake enforcement contracts. He looked like a librarian caught embezzling late fees, rumpled, stunned, lost. But the damage he orchestrated was anything but harmless. He didn't speak. His lawyer entered a plea. Not guilty. The judge presiding was Honorable Deborah Lane, known for her sharp rulings and zero tolerance for manipulation in court. She had once sentenced a pharmaceutical executive to 20 years without parole for falsifying cancer drug trials. Now she stared down this HOA cabal like it was personal. The court recognizes the gravity of this case, she said, voice low but firm. Not just for the defendants, but for every neighborhood in America where perceived power has been used as a weapon against the powerless. She paused, her eyes flickering toward us. And let it be clear, no child should ever be used as a pawn in a game of fear. The prosecution began methodically. First, the footage from our doorbell camera. Caleb's tiny frame. The shove. The stillness. Michelle's scream. My sprint. Then the arrival of real law enforcement. It was all there, unfiltered, unbearable. Played once, then again. On the second run, a few people left the room, unable to watch. Then came the evidence trail. Emails from Rish's account, showing he had paid Centric in response under the table. Surveillance logs from the fake enforcers' devices, showing not just our house but 17 others mapped and marked. Bank statements revealed a string of wire transfers to encrypted accounts under false LLC names. These weren't men who'd snapped under pressure. This was organized, deliberate, structured. But then came the moment that shifted everything. A surprise witness was called, Lisa Harrow, former HOA secretary. A woman who hadn't spoken publicly in 5 years. She was the one who brought the ledger. Mr. Rish altered the HOA bylaws in 2021, she said calmly. Illegally. There was no vote. He then created a shadow board, only him, and used that authority to bring in private enforcers under the label of compliance contractors. She unfolded a printed email, highlighting a line Rish had sent to the security company. The residents won't ask questions. They fear uniforms more than subpoenas. A silence fell over the room. The jury was already scribbling. The prosecution rested. Then it was our turn, not as witnesses, but as humans. They called me to the stand first. I had prepared. I'd rehearsed the facts, reviewed my statements. But when I stood behind that podium, none of that mattered. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what I had to carry. I watched my son draw dinosaurs. I began. That morning, that was the crime. That was his defacement. A T-Rex drawn in green chalk. Not permanent. Not damaging. Just joy. I told them everything. The SUV. The uniforms. The fake charges. The shove. The blood. The helplessness of a parent realizing he'd failed to protect the one thing he loved most in the world. I told them about the surgeries, the nights we didn't sleep, the nightmares, the guilt. Then they called Michelle. Her voice never rose. But it didn't need to. She spoke of the aftermath, the rebroken bones, the flashbacks, the PTSD symptoms. The fact that Caleb still woke up panicked whenever a car with a loud engine passed the house. But the hardest part came next. They called Caleb. He didn't speak. Judge Lane had allowed him to simply appear. No questions, no statements, no pressure. Just presence. He rolled to the front of the courtroom, his tiny hands gripping the arms of his chair. He looked at the 3 men, Blake, Rollins, Rish, and didn't blink. He didn't need to say a word. The power was already his. Then came the verdict. Guilty. On all counts. For Blake and Rollins, multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Rish, 30 years in federal prison, restitution to every family targeted, and a lifetime ban from holding any HOA or residential leadership position. The courtroom didn't cheer. It exhaled. But justice, we realized, was only the beginning. The days after the verdict moved like slow sunlight. Warming, yes, but never fast enough to chase away the shadows. Caleb was safe. The bad men were behind bars. But healing, we quickly learned, was not a destination. It was a war in itself. We brought Caleb home to a changed world. The sidewalk outside our house had transformed into something unrecognizable. Not just the chalk mural, though that alone was a breathtaking ribbon of color stretching across 4 properties, but the energy. Neighbors who used to nod from driveways now lingered longer. Strangers dropped off meals, handwritten letters, even drawings from children in other states. Someone sent a sculpture of a T-Rex made from recycled soda cans. And in the middle of it all, Caleb remained quiet. He no longer feared the dark, but he flinched at sudden voices. His drawings became different, more abstract. Less teeth, more shields. Less dinosaurs, more children holding hands. He never mentioned the attack, not directly. But in every line of chalk, he spoke a new language, survival. Then, one morning, something extraordinary happened. A letter arrived, hand-delivered, with a city seal. It was from the mayor of Cypress Ridge. They were proposing a community reformation initiative, beginning with the park. The same park where Caleb used to ride his scooter before the attack. They wanted to rename it. Not as a memorial, though that's what they first called it, but as a promise. The Caleb Langford Commons. I asked him what he thought. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he whispered, "Can kids draw there?" "They can draw anything they want," I told him. The dedication ceremony came 2 weeks later. A crisp autumn morning, sky clear, the air still holding onto the tail of summer warmth. The crowd wasn't enormous, but it felt infinite, because it was full of people who mattered. Families, teachers, police, veterans, even one former senator. Caleb wore a blazer over his cast. Michelle pressed down the edges of his collar like she was wrapping a flag. He held the microphone with both hands, braced, trembling, but firm. "I thought I was small," he began, voice quiet but amplified by a silence that wanted nothing else but to listen. "I thought when bad people came, I was supposed to run or hide. But then I screamed. I fought, and I found out I wasn't alone." He looked up then, right at the cameras. His face wasn't scared anymore. It was resolved. If you're small, and someone bad comes in a fake uniform or says you have to obey even when it feels wrong, scream. Loud. Scream like a T-Rex. Because the good people will hear you. And they will come. Applause rolled across the commons like thunder. But Caleb didn't flinch this time. He smiled. Wide. Without fear. The mural was unveiled next. A local artist collective had worked for days, painting across the entire southern wall of the recreation building. It showed Caleb, not as he was, but as he had become. A cape billowed behind him, one arm raised, holding a chalk stick like a sword. Around him, shadowy figures of false authority cracked and shattered. In the sky above, truth doesn't wear a badge. It draws its own line. Beneath that mural, something bigger began to grow. Chalk justice, once just a phrase passed between neighbors, had become a national movement. Not just legal aid now, it was a network. With therapists, lawyers, technology specialists, advocacy teams, a hotline, a website, a program for training children in safe authority recognition, all built from the trauma of a child who had once just wanted to draw dinosaurs. By the end of the year, Chalk Justice had helped 78 families in 12 states take legal action against HOA harassment and impersonator abuse. Caleb became the silent founder. He never claimed credit, but his story made others brave enough to speak. Then came the phone call that shifted everything again. It was from a congressional aide. The Community Accountability Act, originally dismissed as symbolic, was now gaining bipartisan traction. Caleb's case had become the face of policy change. The act proposed mandatory ID verification for all HOA enforcement personnel, federal registration system for third-party contractors, cameras worn by any compliance officer when interacting with civilians, severe felony penalties for impersonation of HOA or municipal enforcement, and most controversially, the Caleb Clause, making it a federal crime to detain, threaten, or use force on a minor in the context of property enforcement, regardless of neighborhood bylaw. It passed the House by a landslide. Caleb didn't know what any of that meant. He just knew the world felt different now. Safer. Less gray. But there was one last piece left. The original HOA, Cypress Ridge Civic Association, was still technically active, even after Rish's arrest. A special neighborhood vote was held to decide its fate. Every home received a ballot. Dissolve. Rebuild. Reform. The result? 92% voted to dissolve. What followed was something we didn't expect. Neighbors formed a new council. Not an HOA, but a resident advocacy board, voluntary, transparent, with rotating seats and zero power to fine. Their first vote was symbolic, banning any use of the term compliance officer unless authorized by city ordinance. Their second vote, placing community art installations in every block. They started with sidewalk kits, chalk, brushes, blank boards. Caleb helped design the first one. And so, week by week, chalk reappeared, not just on our street, but across town. Then across counties. Children who had once been warned, "Don't make a mess," were now told, "Draw what matters." I came home one night and found Caleb in the driveway again. No cast this time. Just him, cross-legged, tongue poking slightly out in concentration, working on something new. It wasn't a dinosaur. It was a shield. Bright. Bold. and on the front, he'd written, "Safe." The first day back at school was harder than the surgeries. Not because Caleb couldn't walk properly, his braces had been replaced with ankle supports and a specialized shoe, but because school was where everything had happened before. Before the chalk, before the SUV, before the silence between breaths became louder than any scream. We arrived early. The principal met us at the door, her voice low and full of practiced warmth. Teachers lined the hall like a soft guard of honor. But Caleb didn't want attention. He wanted normal. That was the hard part. Normal had changed. Some kids stared. Others looked away too quickly, afraid to make him feel different, not realizing silence cuts just as sharp as cruelty. A few tried to be overly kind, which somehow made it worse. They offered to carry his backpack, pushed chairs for him, opened his yogurt without being asked. Caleb hated it. At recess, he rolled his chair to the edge of the playground, away from the noise. He pulled something from his bag, a small tin of sidewalk chalk. Without a word, he began drawing on the edge of the blacktop. First a hill, then a sunrise, then a little figure standing on the crest, holding what looked like a glowing staff. Some kids wandered over. They didn't speak. They just sat, watched. Then one asked if he could help. Caleb handed him a piece of chalk. Then another kid joined. Then another. By the time recess ended, a half-dozen children had added suns, trees, stars, animals with swords, and a flying whale. No one said a thing about what happened. They didn't need to. That afternoon, his teacher emailed us a photo of the mural. Caleb was smiling in it. The caption read, "Art doesn't just heal. It unites." That evening, Michelle and I sat with Caleb on the porch. We didn't talk much. But before bed, he asked if we could draw something together tomorrow. Not dinosaurs, he said. Something better. Like what? I asked. A map, he whispered, of all the places that got safer. And so we started building that map. Week by week, letter by letter, Chalk Justice received updates. Messages from families who'd taken their first steps to speak up. A single mother in Phoenix who refused to pay a fake fine. A veteran in Maine who helped his neighbor expose a forged compliance team. A 9-year-old girl in Denver who drew a blue brontosaurus on her driveway with the words, "My sidewalk is mine." Each story became a dot on our living room wall map. A pin, a string, a ripple. 6 months after the trial, we were invited to Washington. Caleb didn't want to go at first. He didn't like crowds, didn't like the cameras. But when we told him they were voting on the Caleb Clause and that he'd be helping other kids he'd never meet, he simply asked, "Do I need to wear a tie?" He wore the raptor pin instead. The vote passed. Unanimously. For the first time in congressional history, a clause named after a child passed with 0 objections. The chamber stood. Not a ceremony. A statement. After the announcement, an aide approached him. "You know, Caleb, you're probably the youngest person in this room who actually changed the law." Caleb looked up at him, shrugged slightly, and said, "I just screamed." And that was the truth. He screamed. We listened. The world shifted. In the months that followed, things didn't magically become perfect. HOA abuse still existed. There were still impersonators, still threats, still stories too late to be stopped. But there was also something else now. A system, a response, a community, and something better than fear awareness. 1 year to the day after the attack, a package arrived on our doorstep. No return address. Just a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a canvas. A painting. It showed Caleb standing in a field of color. Behind him, children of all kinds, diverse, defiant, glowing with purpose, each holding a piece of chalk. The background was a blur of monsters, fading into mist. Above them all, a banner that read, "They broke Bones, but couldn't break the boy." Tears blurred my vision as I turned the canvas over. On the back, a single note written in block letters. From a kid who was too scared to scream, until he saw someone else do it first. And so, if you ever walk past our street in Cypress Ridge, you might notice something odd about the sidewalks. They're never clean. Because every Saturday, someone, sometimes Caleb, sometimes a neighbor, sometimes a kid from across town comes to draw. Dinosaurs. Castles. Suns. Shields. Maps. Dreams. And none of it ever gets washed away. Not because it can't be, but because we remember what it cost to draw them in the first place.